right, today we're going to be talking about a topic that several of you have requested in recent weeks and months, and that is Bitcoin's security budget. What even is the security budget? Is Bitcoin security doomed without something like a tail emission? Today we're going to break it all down and discuss. Let's jump in. So there are a number of things that are fairly predictable in the bowels of a bear market, and one of those is the resurfacing of FUD around Bitcoin security budget. This just tends to be one of those topics that comes around. You have to realize that crypto influencers out there that make money off of engagement is a very engaging topic, right? To write a thread about how Bitcoin security is doomed to failure. But don't get me wrong, there is a very real and honest discussion to be had about this topic. So today we're going to try and examine the claim that Bitcoin security is doomed, and we're going to talk about what aspects of this argument are unfounded versus things that we should be taking seriously. And so first, let's define the term because it gets thrown around casually, both in favor of Bitcoin and against Bitcoin. And really, as Pierre kind of cheekily points out here, Bitcoin doesn't have a, quote, security budget. The finality of transactions is secured by permissionless proof of work combined with the ability for users to bid on fees. What he's really saying here is that there is no like magical threshold of, quote, security that makes Bitcoin either secure or not secure. That would be rather subjective, right? And furthermore, there are different aspects to security. Keep in mind that a miner is not going to hack my private key, assuming that I have stored it with best practices. And I've got a whole lot of different tutorials on this video that show you just how to do that, right? Finding a hash collision to guess my private key, you have as infinitesimally a small chance of doing that as randomly identifying a particular atom in the known universe. So as part of this discussion, we're not really going to talk about like if you have Bitcoin in a UTXO deep within the ledger, I just don't see a kind of plausible, reasonable threat to that, right? So the security that we're going to be talking about and referencing in most part today is something like a 51% attack, right? Miners behaving maliciously to perhaps perform a denial of service attack, meaning, you know, they can just put empty blocks onto the blockchain and censor your transactions and not include them. So we'll come back to all that, but back to the term security budget, Pierre is right? There is no magical like threshold, you know, that we can identify. But perhaps a more practical way to define this term is the total revenue that miners make for performing their settlement services, i.e. packaging up transactions and attaching them as part of a next block in the blockchain. And for those who might be newer to Bitcoin, recall that Bitcoin's monetary policy is fixed, meaning we know how many will exist. And so we can see that mapped out where you've got the blue line here, which is the total supply of Bitcoin going from time zero to block height out probably to the year 2140 or so. And you can see that the blue line asymptotically increases until just about 21 million. And the orange line is the inflation rate of supply. You can see on the y-axis on the right-hand side. And so that new issuance rate is cut in half programmatically roughly every 4 years, or every 210,000 Bitcoin blocks to be exact. And recall that there is probabilistically a new Bitcoin block every 10 minutes. So security budget, or the total revenue that miners are bringing in, is comprised of two components. One is the block subsidy, meaning the new issuance of Bitcoin that comes into existence with the mining of every incremental block, according to that monetary policy we just discussed. And then secondly are the transaction fees. It's what you and I as users pay for miners to settle our transactions. And so you can start to see where critics are coming from when they say that, oh, the long-term security budget or the long-term security of Bitcoin is doomed, it's broken, right? It's as you have the block subsidy getting cut in half every 4 years to a terminal rate of 0, the question is, are transaction fees going to be enough to incentivize honest behavior of miners, right? So the idea is that as that security budget or as that amount of revenue for behaving honestly goes down, then it becomes easier to perform different types of attacks on the network. So for example, a 51% attack would be some actor or group of actors working together to command 51% of the hash rate or 51% of the mining network, which, if sustained, and that's a key topic we'll come back to, could cause a lot of disruption for Bitcoin and could potentially even challenge this notion that it's this, uncensorable, permissionless money. And so let's keep thinking that through. What are some specific examples of attack vectors for how this could unfold? Well, one is, let's say that, in the future, transaction fees are very low and they're only enough to sustain but so many miners, and a bunch of miners go offline, take their hash power offline, and now all of a sudden you're left with a smaller amount of hash rate. Maybe a malicious actor such as a government could come and spin up a bunch of ASICs and have a much easier time commandeering 51% of the total network, and could then launch an attack such as withholding transactions from blocks, packaging empty blocks to the blockchain, creating their own fork, and other such disruptions. And so this could really rattle confidence in Bitcoin as a system. It wouldn't mean it's necessarily doomed. You could still get a transaction through when it's picked up by an honest miner who's still acting honestly. But again, even then, there has to be this large kind of summoning of resources. ASIC manufacturing, it's pretty hard to conceal that at a large scale. And the mobilization of this new hash rate would be visible to other participants. And so the question is, could an attack be conducted covertly and in secret for long enough and sustained for long enough before other actors are aware of it? Right? Would this malicious actor even be able to secure all the ASICs that they need or spin up the production capacity to even build all of them? There's a lot of assumptions that go into this kind of hypothetical attack. And the fact that Bitcoin hasn't been successfully 51% attacked, I think, is very telling. Market losing forks of Bitcoin, such as BSV or Bitcoin Cash, have, again, I think tells you something. But let's think through another attack vector. This one I think is a little more interesting and is discussed in this tweet from Mira Hurley. Mira is a crypto influencer known for shitting all over Bitcoin. And so she says, took a quick look at Bitcoin's security spend. In short, not looking good. So what she is comparing to is she's actually looking at the annual security spend. So again, total revenue coming into miners, compared to the market cap. Okay, so why is she doing that? As she describes lower in the thread, the attack vector here could basically be, look, what if I'm a big miner or a large entity of some kind? What I could do is take out a massive short position on Bitcoin, right? And the bigger that market cap gets, the more money I stand to make if something terrible were to happen to Bitcoin and I profit in my short position, right? And so what she's arguing here is, as the security spend becomes a lower and lower percent of the market cap, there is a greater incentive, or it becomes more profitable to perform such an attack. So the steps would basically go, I'm a big entity, I take out a massive short position on Bitcoin, and then I somehow either amass the hash rate or perhaps bribe a coalition of miners and pay them more than they would otherwise get for performing honestly, right? So if I bribe the miners and pay them more than what they would otherwise get paid honestly, and I bribe them to basically package empty blocks, disrupt the blockchain, refuse to settle transactions, all of a sudden there may be doubts to Bitcoin's true sort of censorship resistant qualities that are a big part of its value prop. And therefore the price would then fall and I would profit massively from this short position. That's a pretty elaborate scheme, but it is interesting. And I think it gives us another way to think about the potential attack vector as it relates to this idea of security spend. But let's examine this a little more closely. Well, for one, whoops, poor timing on that one, because she posted that in April, and just the very next month, we had a lot of the fee craze with things like ordinals. I did a whole video on ordinals and inscriptions, BRC20 tokens, if you're curious to check some of that out. But as we can see in this monthly view, Bitcoin transaction fees as a percent of total miner revenue spiked to nearly 14% in May. Now, keep in mind, that is a different metric than what Mira was showing, but I did the math, and if you basically annualize out May, which is not a fair comparison, right? We saw that those fees did come down a little bit month to date in June so far, but June is at a higher water level than what we saw earlier in the year and certainly last year. But basically, if you do the math, you would suddenly reverse this trend a number of years back to something like 2020. That's not intended to be this huge gotcha for Mira, nor to claim that we're ever going to massively reverse to some of the really, truly big numbers that were in that last column. But it serves to demonstrate the first critical point of this argument, which is that we have no idea what future demand looks like. We know that Bitcoin supply as well as block space is scarce, right? Is truly scarce, and it's demand that is unknown. And so a lot of these doomsday discussions implicitly embed an assumption that demand for Bitcoin block space will somehow not grow fast enough, which obviously we don't know. And if anything, we've continued to see more demand for block space over time. And in fact, people will say, well, yeah, but who's going to pay, $80 or $100 for settling a transaction on chain? When we've seen absolutely no empirical evidence whatsoever, people get deterred during periods of higher fees. Yes, there is a market dynamic inherent in fees. You're going to see people intelligently putting fees in, but for example, when you've had periods of high fees during past big bull run-ups, you really haven't seen a ratcheting of transaction volume in the way that you would. So there's simply no empirical evidence to suggest that people will be unwilling to pay for this precious resource that is Bitcoin block space. Nor has there been any demonstration that there is a viable alternative, right? Out of thousands and thousands and thousands of altcoins and alternative blockchains, Bitcoin nonetheless retains 50% of the total market cap. This is after well over a decade of altcoins existing. So that tells you something about how the market values block space across these respective ecosystems. And don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that we should do the reverse and blindly assume that there will be sufficient demand to justify reasonably high fees to keep miner actions reasonably honest. But there simply is no evidence to justify the claim that we laid out previously. And so as Bitcoin's network effect grows, demand for block space also grows with it. And so the important part is continuing to build value around Bitcoin. So all the companies building around Bitcoin or the Lightning Network or other L2s that we'll eventually see, a sort of embedded FOMO loop of the halving, which brings new entrants in every single cycle. As that demand grows, you absolutely will see continued increases in fees. Dan Held has done some good math on this, looking at what if Bitcoin was a $10 trillion market cap? Or what if it was a $100 trillion market cap? And he estimates that the average cost for an on-chain fee at those levels would be something like $8 in the $10 trillion scenario and $80 in the $100 trillion scenario. And while that may sound like a lot, it is likely to be the case that the base protocol will be used for large transactions, right? We're talking, potentially settling millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars in a single transaction. A few dozen dollars is minuscule in comparison. So that's really point one, is all of these doomsday scenarios have some implicit assumptions about what future demand will look like. And yet we continue to see new revenue streams for miners. We continue to see things like ordinals, right? No one saw the fee spike due to ordinals coming. There's certainly a question around how sustained will that demand for block space be. And while it's certainly come down from some of its May highs, it is still very much elevated. And you can see the mempool continues to be relatively congested. So that suggests that some of these new use cases have staying power. We'll also likely see new L2s in the future. I recently did a video on Arc, talked a little bit about Enigma. You have other side chains that do merged mining. You have other blockchains entirely that anchor into Bitcoin and inherit some of its security through transactions that happen on chain. So you have all these sources of demand for Bitcoin block space. And you also, interestingly, are now seeing some of these like transaction acceleration services from the likes of mempool.space. You also have Binance that's recently rolled this out. So what this is a way for you to conduct what are called out-of-band transactions, meaning you're not broadcasting the transaction in a typical way and putting it in the mempool or the area where transactions are pending for miners to pluck them up. And rather, you're sort of going straight to the miner, and you basically have some sort of deal with the miner. And so this does have some negative implications in terms of like if fee pricing based on the mempool is not accurate, because there's a lot of activity happening outside of the mempool process, that could become an issue. But it represents an interesting new revenue stream, and I think we're going to see a lot of different flavors of that. And then furthermore, in relation to Mira's sort of hypothetical scenario, as Joe Burnett points out, there are a lot of assumptions that go into this. So again, he says, what would be your attack strategy? And as we were describing earlier, she says, short a large percentage of Bitcoin's market cap, then use my 51% to mine empty blocks, censor everyone else from the network, prove that Bitcoin is centralized, vulnerable, blah, 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 blah. And as Joe rightly points out, so enable no one to move coins to an exchange but bet on the price going down, right? Like that's a massive assumption to make. This is a humongous bet that is far from certain. And as he says later in this thread, users can wait it out. They can bid higher fees. They can deploy ASICs. To think that no one will react to this attack is laughable at best. And so we can start to think about some of the mitigation tactics for different flavors of these attacks. So for a scenario where the attacker wants to profit, right? This is not just like a malicious attack to defeat Bitcoin no matter the cost, but the attacker really wants to profit from this. A lot of folks discount the fact that users are empowered to use the mempool and replace by fee features of Bitcoin to bid up fees, which increasingly places pressure on the attacker because it increases the incentive of honest behavior. So again, this is what these attacks also fail to acknowledge, is that there is a clear mitigation strategy from users themselves. And ultimately, if users bid fees high enough, it would make more sense for the attacker to be honest than to be performing the attack. Again, this is if the attacker has a profit motivation. If they don't, if this is just like a government agency wanting to destroy Bitcoin by making it unusable by censoring transactions from blocks, number one, users can simply be a little more patient and wait for an honest miner to pick up their transaction. You could have something like a user-activated fork where you change perhaps the mining algorithm. You go from SHA-256 to something else and therefore render all the existing ASICs obsolete. Now, to be clear, this would be enormously messy and enormously controversial and like the nuclear option. But this sort of social consensus, this social layer, is the ultimate backstop. Do you really think that all the hardcore Bitcoiners that are out there that have stored their life force in Bitcoin are just going to go down without a fight? Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of criticism from Bitcoiners towards Ethereans when they use this argument to say, well, with proof of stake, we'll just fork around the attacking malicious actor. So, right, it can go both ways. But the fact is that you have this nuclear option as a measure of last resort as well. Hopefully it never comes to that. Additionally, socially and politically, these types of actors that could conduct such an attack where they have no profit motive and it's just to destroy this thing, well, they better hurry up, because at least in the US, for example, you've got presidential candidates on both sides, both main parties, that are pro-Bitcoin. You have probably 10-15% of the population that owns it, including lots of politicians. And this is not just in the US. This is increasingly the case globally, everywhere. And so if governments are really the only types of entities who might conduct such a attack that's not motivated whatsoever by profit, the sum of money they would have to expend to do that is something that would be pretty tough to do. Like, they're probably going to have to reveal that in some way, or it's just going to be very, very hard for them to do that discreetly. And they're certainly not going to be able to do that as an increasing share of their population has skin in the game with Bitcoin. So the window for that type of attack is probably closing anyways. And furthermore, going back to the different dimensions of security, keep in mind that what we're talking about here, these kind of denial of service attacks, these 51% attacks, these really have to do with the tip of the chain, i.e. the last few blocks. To go deeper and reorg the blockchain at a deeper level would require massive, massive resources that at this point is just not feasible. And as we talked about earlier, no one's gonna break your private key if properly held. And so these attacks are impacting the tip of the chain. And while yes, that would no doubt be disruptive, it would shake confidence. It's not at all clear to me that that would spell the disaster and doom and end of Bitcoin, right? Especially when there are these multiple layers of potential mitigating actions from motivated, honest participants on the network. So with all that, let's go ahead and conclude today's video. All right, so today we talked about this concept of a security budget, probably more helpfully defined as the total revenue that miners take in for performing settlement services of the Bitcoin blockchain. And we talked about the number of the assumptions that are embedded in the claim that, oh, Bitcoin's long-term security is doomed. And so we looked at the different facets of that. I am by no means claiming that this is an exhaustive video, nor am I claiming that we should just sort of put this topic on the bookshelf and never think about it again. I do think it's healthy to have an adversarial mindset, especially with decentralized systems like Bitcoin. And it certainly shouldn't lead us to become complacent and with this idea that, oh, Bitcoin, it's just perfect and nothing could ever go wrong. But hopefully the data and just the logic we presented in this video helps temper those concerns, right? I think they are overwhelmingly overblown. And if you dig deeper into the people that are often espousing these claims, you'll see that they they have big bags in other crypto tokens, right? So Matthew Cratter from Bitcoin University did an excellent video on this topic that I will link in the description down below, where he absolutely blasts this crypto expert hedge fund researcher guy, Justin Bonds, who's just an absolute troll all the time on Twitter. So I'd invite you to check that out. I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on the debate that will no doubt continue to rage? Let me know in the comments down below. But I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video. That really does help get this to a broader audience. If you were so enamored with this content, you want to donate to a pleb, which really does help me continue to make these videos, there are a number of ways that you can do so. There's a super thanks feature built right into YouTube. If you've got something like the Get Alby Lightning Wallet browser extension, you can just click that and it'll automatically detect that you're on my channel, and you can send sats that way. Or finally, I will have my Strike account and Lightning address on the final page momentarily. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave this here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.